Single dad ignores a woman until his daughter says, "That's mommy." Before we get into it, if this video found you at the right moment, let me know with your favorite emoji. The morning of November 14th was the kind of cold that Chicago does better than anywhere else in the world. A wind that doesn't just chill your skin. It reaches inside you and squeezes something vital. William Hart turned up the collar of his charcoal wool overcoat, the one that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and stepped out of the lobby of the Meridian Tower onto Michigan Avenue without breaking his stride. He never broke his stride. In 11 years of building Hart Capital Group from a 2-desk startup into a $2 billion empire, William had learned that hesitation was the most expensive habit a man could have. He was 37 years old, with the kind of face that photographers described as commanding, strong jaw, dark eyes that processed information faster than most people formed sentences, and just enough silver threading through his black hair to signal authority without suggesting age. He wore his wealth with the specific understatement of someone who had earned it. No jewelry, no flashy accessories, just the overcoat, the custom-fitted suit beneath it, and shoes that shone the way things shine when they're cared for every single day without exception. His assistant, Marcus, walked 3 steps behind him, holding 2 phones and a leather portfolio, reciting the morning briefing with the efficiency of a military officer reporting field conditions to a general who was already 3 moves ahead. 8 a.m., quarterly review with the Singapore team. 9:30, call with Senator Dawson's office regarding the infrastructure bill. 11, Natalie's school calls if you haven't confirmed the winter recital, which you haven't. 2:30, the Brennan Group lunch, though I've moved it to 3 because their CFO has a conflict. "I'll confirm the recital today," William said, in the tone that meant he would absolutely not confirm it today. "You said that yesterday, sir." "Then I'll confirm it twice tomorrow." Marcus made a note. He had worked for William for 6 years and learned to translate "I'll handle it" into its true meaning. Schedule a reminder for someone else to handle it. It wasn't that William was a bad father. It was that William was a father the way he was everything else, with enormous intention and almost no time. He had cleared space in his life for Natalie the way an architect clears space in a building, precisely, efficiently, making sure the room had everything it needed while rarely stopping to ask whether the room itself was what the occupant truly required. This was the gap between his intentions and his reality, and it was a gap he preferred not to measure. The sidewalk was busy with the usual Tuesday morning current of commuters, delivery workers, dog walkers, and tourists who hadn't yet learned that Chicago in November was not a tourist city. William moved through them like water around stone, automatic and efficient, his mind already half in the Singapore call. He passed the coffee cart on the corner without stopping. Marcus had already secured his order for pickup at the office. He passed the newspaper stand. He passed the bus shelter with its cracked plastic panel held together with electrical tape. He passed 2 men in hard hats consulting a blueprint in front of a scaffolded building. And he passed the woman. She was sitting with her back against the wall of the old Hendricks building, the one that had been under renovation for 4 years and probably always would be. She wore a dark green army jacket 2 sizes too large, faded jeans with a tear at one knee, and shoes that had started life as white sneakers and ended up the color of the street itself. A canvas bag sat beside her, stuffed with the architecture of a life reduced to what could be carried. Her head was down, her hair, the color of autumn leaves if you happened to notice, which almost no one did, fell across her face in pieces. She had placed a paper cup on the pavement in front of her, a detail so small and so worn in that it registered as furniture rather than gesture. No sign, no eye contact, just a woman and a cup, and the practiced invisibility of someone who had learned that the city would not see her whether she asked to be seen or not. William did not notice her. Not consciously. His eyes tracked forward and his feet carried him past her at the same pace they carried him past every other fixture of the street. She was part of the urban landscape, the way a mailbox was, or a fire hydrant. He was already 3 steps past her when the small hand found his. "Daddy, stop." Natalie was 6 years old, and when she decided something required stopping, the entire world was expected to comply. She had her father's dark eyes and her mother's. Well, he didn't finish that thought anymore. She was wearing her red coat with the brass buttons that her nanny, Patricia, had fastened precisely that morning. and her dark hair was in two braids that were already coming slightly undone at the left side, because Natalie believed that perfection in hairstyling was for people with nothing better to think about. She was carrying her school bag on her back with the slight forward lean of a person who takes responsibilities seriously, which Natalie always did. William stopped. He looked down at his daughter, then followed her gaze back toward the wall of the Hendricks building. "We're going to be late, sweetheart," he said gently. He was dropping her at school before heading to the office, one of the 3 mornings per week he had committed to doing personally. A commitment his therapist called meaningful engagement, and his schedule called operationally inconvenient. "That lady," Natalie said. She wasn't pointing, she'd been taught pointing was rude, but her whole small body was oriented like a compass toward the woman in the green jacket. "There are a lot of people on the street." "Nat, come on. She looks cold. It's November in Chicago. Everyone looks cold." "Daddy." The word carried the full moral weight that only a 6-year-old can load into 2 syllables. "She looks really cold, and she doesn't have a cup of coffee like everybody else." William exhaled. He looked at Natalie, her small face upturned. Serious, utterly immune to the concept of being in a hurry, and understood that they were not moving forward until he did something. He reached into his coat pocket, found a folded 20, and walked back the 3 steps to where the woman sat. He crouched slightly and held the bill toward her. "Here," he said. "Get yourself something warm." The woman didn't move for a moment. Then she raised her head. And William Hart, who had negotiated with senators and outmaneuvered the sharpest financial minds in the country, who had survived the worst night of his life and rebuilt everything that mattered, felt nothing, no recognition, no spark of memory, just the face of a stranger, hollow-cheeked, eyes red-rimmed from cold or crying or both, lips chapped, a small scar above her left eyebrow that he didn't register as meaningful. She looked like what she was, a woman the world had discarded, a woman who had once been someone and had become, through circumstances he didn't pause to imagine, no one. She took the 20 without a word. Her hand was shaking. "Come on, Nat," William said, standing. And they walked on. Natalie looked back twice. The second time, her small brow furrowed with the particular expression she wore when filing something away in whatever careful internal system she used to organize the world. It was the expression of a child who already knows the answer, but is waiting patiently for the adults to arrive at it. William did not look back once. 45 minutes later, in the back of his car between the school drop-off and the office, his phone buzzed with a text from Patricia. "Natalie said something strange this morning. She told me the lady on the street was her mommy. I told her that wasn't possible. She got very quiet and asked me if I was sure. I told her I was sure. She said, 'I don't think you are. I thought you should know.'" William read the message twice, then a third time. He set the phone down on the seat beside him and stared at the back of his driver's headrest for the remaining 8 minutes of the ride. The city moved past the window, glass and steel and the flat gray lake in the distance, and he sat very still inside the moving car and understood that something had happened this morning that he was not ready to examine. Not yet. He did not go back to Michigan Avenue that day, but Natalie's words had planted something in him that he wasn't yet willing to name, a splinter too deep to ignore, too dangerous to examine in the light. By the time he sat down for the Singapore call, he had buried it in the place where he kept everything he couldn't afford to feel during business hours. He was very good at that place. He had been building and furnishing and filling it for 6 full years. The quarterly numbers were strong. The Singapore team was pleased. Senator Dawson's office confirmed the call for 9:30, and the discussion went smoothly. And somewhere on Michigan Avenue, in the cold shadow of a building that was always being renovated and never quite finished, a woman in a green army jacket sat with a folded $20 bill in her shaking hand and looked at the space where a man and a small girl had just been standing. She did not move for a long time. The paper cup in front of her held $3.40 in the cold November wind, and she sat with it like a woman keeping vigil over something she had not yet been given permission to hope for. Her name had been Zoe Hart for 4 years and Zoe Callahan for the 27 before that. And now it was neither. Now it was just Zoe, if anyone asked, which almost no one did. The shelter on West Jackson required a full name for their intake forms, and she wrote Zoe Marie Callahan in the faded box with the pen that was chained to the desk, because things with value had to be protected. She did not write Hart. That name felt like standing inside a house that had burned down. The walls were gone, but you could still see where they'd been, and your hand still remembered the shape of the door. She was 31 years old. In the photograph on her expired Illinois driver's license, the one she kept in the inside pocket of the army jacket because it was the last legal proof that she existed as someone specific, she was 25, with full cheeks and a smile that believed in things. That woman felt like a stranger now, the kind of stranger you pass on the street without stopping, without registering, without understanding that you once knew everything about her and she knew everything about you. She had arrived at the shelter 43 days ago, which she knew because she marked the days on a small piece of paper, folded into the pocket alongside the license. Not obsessively, just a small vertical mark each morning when she woke, a way of keeping the days distinct from one another. Because losing track of time was one of the ways that people in her situation disappeared entirely into themselves, and she had decided in the cold and quiet logic of someone who had already hit the absolute floor that she was not going to disappear. Not now. Not completely. The shelter had its own rhythms, its own language of survival. Morning call was at 6:30, and Zoe had learned to be awake before it. Not because she slept well, but because waking before the announcement gave her a small measure of control over the day. She would lie in the gray pre-dawn light and listen to the other women breathe, four strangers held together by circumstance, and the shared understanding that pride was a luxury that had to be temporarily set aside without being permanently surrendered. There was a woman named Ruth in the cot across from hers who had been a schoolteacher in Evanston for 22 years. There was a woman named Carmen who spoke very little English but who, every morning without fail, pressed her palms together and bowed her head for 30 seconds before rising. Zoe found this more sustaining than she had expected. The small devotions of other people, witnessed quietly, had a way of reminding her that she was not the only person in the world working hard to keep something intact. The morning after the encounter on Michigan Avenue, Zoe lay on her cot in the women's dormitory and stared at the water-stained ceiling and thought about the child. She had known immediately, the way you know your own heartbeat, the way you recognize a melody you learned before you had words for music. The dark hair, the precise small chin, the eyes that looked at the world with that particular quality of serious attention. Natalie, her daughter, 6 years old now, which meant she had been 4 months old when Zoe left, too small to remember, too small to know what she was losing, except that apparently she knew anyway, in the deep animal way that children know things that logic hasn't taught them yet. She looks like her father, Zoe thought, staring at the ceiling's water stains like they were a map she was trying to read. She looks exactly like her father. And then, because she wasn't strong enough for the rest of it yet, she pressed her palms flat against the rough blanket and focused on the simple mechanics of breathing. In, out, present, here. She had been a different person when she married William Hart, not a better person, necessarily, but a complete one, someone whose life had edges that touched other lives in visible ways. She had been a graphic designer at a small firm in the West Loop, the kind of work that didn't pay lavishly but felt like building something real with her hands every day. She had been William's wife for 4 years, and for most of those years she had loved him the way you love something you're a little afraid of losing, fiercely and with a constant low-grade anxiety that she mistook, for a long time, for passion. But there had been a darkness in her that she had hidden from him, not intentionally, not in the beginning. She had simply not known how large it was, how deep the roots went, how much of her was built on ground that could dissolve when the right pressure was applied. The anxiety that she managed with routines and discipline slowly evolved, after Natalie's birth, into something that routines couldn't contain. Postpartum depression was the clinical phrase her mind offered when she could stand back far enough to apply a label. But what she experienced felt less like depression and more like the ground dissolving beneath her feet. Every day, a little more, a little quieter, a little more complete. She smiled through it. She cooked through it. She held her daughter through it with arms that felt increasingly like they belonged to someone else. And when Natalie was 4 months old and William was in Tokyo for a conference, and the babysitter had gone home, and she was alone in the enormous apartment on Lakeshore Drive at 2 in the morning with a baby who wouldn't stop crying, and a mind that had finally exhausted its last defense. She did the thing that she had been unconsciously planning without knowing she was planning it. She left. Not a dramatic exit. No note, no confrontation, no final scene built for someone to find later and understand. She simply walked out of the apartment with her coat and her license and $40 in her wallet, telling herself she would come back when she was better, when she was fixed, when she was safe to be around her own child. She told herself that, for 6 years. She believed it for fewer than she cared to count. The healing had not gone the way she had promised herself it would. The darkness had not lifted cleanly or promptly on any schedule she could control. There had been stretches of steadiness. A job at a diner in Wicker Park for 8 months. A room in a boarding house that smelled of old wood and someone else's cooking. A therapist she could afford twice a month who had a gift for asking the exact right question at the exact wrong moment. And then the diner closed, and the boarding house room went with it, and the therapist moved to Portland, and the steadiness collapsed in increments too small to name, until one morning she was sitting outside a CVS on Michigan Avenue, with everything she owned in a canvas bag, watching the city move without her. She had recognized William immediately when he passed. The stride, the jaw, the way his shoulders carried the weight of perpetual decision like a man born knowing that someone had to be in charge, and who had simply never stopped being that someone. 6 years had refined him the way certain metals are refined, harder, brighter, more precisely himself. She had sat very still and watched him pass, and she thought, he still doesn't look sideways. He had never looked sideways. It was one of the things she had loved and one of the things she hadn't. And then she had looked at the small girl beside him. The red coat, the brass buttons, the 2 braids coming undone on the left side. The serious, measuring gaze that was somehow entirely familiar even at a distance of years and feet and everything between them. And Zoe had felt something shift beneath her ribs. Not hope exactly. Not yet. But the precondition of hope. The breath before the word. She had not slept the night after. She lay in the shelter cot and understood that something had changed. Not in the world, but in the arrangement of possibilities within it. The man who had given her $20 without recognizing her was her husband. The child with the braids was her daughter. The life she had walked away from was less than half a mile from where she was sleeping on a cot in the dark. These facts existed simultaneously, without resolution, like chords pressing against each other, waiting for a fourth note that could make them into music. She did not have a plan. She was not sure she deserved one. But she found herself 2 mornings later, sitting on the same stretch of sidewalk outside the Hendricks building. Not because she expected anything. Not because she had constructed a scenario that ended well and starred a version of herself she recognized. But because the world was large and cold, and that particular stretch of pavement, for reasons she couldn't entirely justify, felt like the last coordinate where she had been seen. Really seen. Even accidentally, even in the confusion of a 6-year-old's certainty. In longer than she could measure. She told herself she was not waiting for them to come back. She was very good at telling herself things she didn't fully believe. The paper cup sat in front of her. The wind moved through the November street. And she watched the entrance of every building with the careful, patient attention of a woman who understood that the most important moments in a life often arrive without announcement. Patricia Nguyen had been Natalie Hart's primary caregiver for 5.5 years, which meant she had been, functionally, the most constant female presence in Natalie's daily life since before the child could hold her own spoon. Patricia was 44, practical, warm in the specific way of someone who had decided that love was a professional responsibility, as much as it was a feeling. And she took her job with the seriousness of a person who understood that she was not merely an employee, but a structural element of a small person's world. She noticed things. It was the main qualification for her work. She noticed, for instance, that Natalie had been different since Tuesday. Not dramatically. Natalie was not a dramatic child. She was precise and observant and economical with her emotions in a way that Patricia privately found both admirable and slightly heartbreaking for a 6-year-old. But since Tuesday there was a quality of preoccupation in her that hadn't been there before. At breakfast, instead of reading her book while eating, a habit she'd maintained since age 4, she sat with her spoon in her cereal and looked at nothing. At school pickup, Patricia noticed her pause at the car door and scanned the street in a specific direction. Westward, toward Michigan Avenue. "Did you dream last night?" Patricia asked on Thursday morning because it was a useful, neutral entry point. "Yes," Natalie said. "Good dream or bad dream?" "A remembering dream," Natalie said, which was not a category Patricia had offered, and which therefore required a moment of processing. "What did you remember?" Natalie considered the question with her characteristic gravity. She was eating a piece of toast now, holding it in both hands with the concentration of someone reading an important document. "Her hands," she said finally. Patricia did not ask who. She had been in this household long enough to know which her Natalie meant. Even when the subject was technically forbidden, not by rule but by the elaborate silence that William had built around it the way you build walls around something you don't want to examine in daylight. "Your mommy's hands?" Patricia asked carefully. "They were soft," Natalie said. "In the dream." She put down her toast. "The lady on the street had the same hands." "Natalie," Patricia said gently, "you were 4 months old when—" "I know," Natalie said, in the tone she used when she'd already completed a logical process that adults were still beginning. "But I remembered anyway." Patricia texted William that evening. "She's still thinking about Tuesday. I don't think it's going to pass on its own." She mentioned the woman's hands. William read the message in his home office at 9:15, between the Singapore debrief and a draft term sheet he was reviewing for a hotel acquisition in Miami. He held the phone for a moment longer than the message required, then typed back, "I'll talk to her this weekend." He set a reminder on his calendar and moved on to the term sheet. The weekend arrived. He knew because Natalie appeared in the doorway of his office at 7:45 on Friday evening, wearing her pajamas with the small foxes on them and carrying the chapter book she was currently reading. A story about a girl who discovers a secret garden, which Patricia said she had read twice already. She stood in the doorway without speaking, which was her method of requesting entry. "Come in," William said, turning his chair. She crossed the office and climbed into the second chair, the guest chair, the leather one that was too large for her and which she occupied with complete dignity anyway, and opened her book. This was also part of the ritual. She didn't always want to talk. Sometimes she just wanted to be in the same room. William had learned over 6 years of imperfect fatherhood that this was its own form of conversation, the kind that didn't require words and was often more honest than the kind that did. They sat in comfortable quiet for 12 minutes. Then Natalie said without looking up from her book, "The lady on the street, did you see her face?" William was quiet for a moment. "Briefly," he said. "I think I know her." "You've never met her, sweetheart." "I don't mean met." She turned a page deliberately. "I mean know. Like how you know a song even when you've never heard it before because it sounds like something that was already inside you." William looked at his daughter. He thought, not for the first time, that she had been born with a kind of emotional precision that he had spent his entire adult life trying to develop and still hadn't fully achieved. "That's a very poetic way to describe it," he said carefully. "Patricia says I have an imagination." She said it neutrally, neither agreeing nor disagreeing, as if she were examining the claim from a professional distance. "But I don't think it's imagination." "What do you think it is?" She looked up then, her dark eyes finding his with the directness that always slightly disarmed him. The gaze of someone who had decided that honesty was more efficient than strategy. "I think she's my mommy," Natalie said. "And I think you already know that and you're scared." The room was very quiet. Outside, the November wind pressed against the window glass. The desk lamp made a small warm circle in the larger dark of the room, and somewhere in the building below them the elevator hummed and fell silent. "Nat," he began. "You don't have to say anything," she said with a kind of grace that shouldn't belong to a 6-year-old. "I just wanted you to know that I know." She looked back at her book. "We should find her before it gets colder." William did not sleep that night. He lay in the dark of his bedroom, the bedroom he had shared with Zoe for 4 years, though it had been completely redecorated since, as if new furniture could rewrite the architecture of memory, and he conducted the inventory he had been avoiding for 6 days. The woman's hands, which had been shaking, the color of her hair, the scar above the left eyebrow, which he hadn't consciously registered on the sidewalk, but which was surfacing now with the clarity of something his mind had stored without permission, without his consent, without bothering to ask whether he was ready to hold it. Zoe had gotten that scar at 23, from a car door that someone swung too fast in a parking garage on a Tuesday in June. She had laughed about it at the time. She had said, "It's fine, it'll heal, stop fussing." He had kissed it anyway. He thought about the specific quality of Natalie's patience. She had never asked why in the direct way that required a direct answer. She asked around the subject carefully, feeling for the edges, trusting that the full shape would eventually become clear. He had told himself this was resilience. He understood now it was something else entirely. The patience of a child who had decided, somewhere below language, that the answer would come when the adults were finally ready to give it. She had been waiting for him, 6 years old, and she had been waiting with more grace than he deserved. He sat up at 2 in the morning and turned on his bedside lamp and stared at the far wall for a long time. Then he picked up his phone and found the contact for his private investigator, a man named Douglas Cole, who had helped him with a due diligence situation 18 months ago, and who was, above all other qualities, discreet, and typed a message. "I need you to find someone. It may be easier than you think. I believe she's in the shelter system in the Loop or near North Side. I'll send details in the morning." He did not send the details in the morning. He sent them at 2:47 because he was not a man who, once he decided something, was able to wait for daylight to make it official. The woman's name, he wrote, was Zoe Marie Callahan, or possibly Zoe Hart, 31 years old, auburn hair, a scar above her left eyebrow. The last time he had seen her, until 6 days ago, although he hadn't known it then, she was 25 years old and standing in the kitchen of their apartment on Lakeshore Drive, smiling at him over a cup of coffee before he left for the airport. She had been wearing the blue sweater with the loose thread at the cuff. He had meant to remind her to fix it. He never had. He pressed send. Then he turned off the lamp and lay back in the dark and listened to the wind against the glass and understood, with the clarity that only comes at 2 in the morning when all the useful lies have gone to sleep, that the splinter had worked its way too deep to leave alone. Whatever came next was going to cost him something. He didn't yet know what. But he had spent 6 years telling himself that Zoe Callahan had made her choice, and that grief was a project you completed and moved on from. And he understood now, with the cold certainty of a man whose 6-year-old daughter was wiser than him, had always been wiser than him, that he had never actually believed any of it. The case, Douglas Cole confirmed at 7:15 the next morning, would be straightforward. "I'll have a location by end of day." William read the message in the kitchen, standing up with his coffee in his hand. Natalie was at the table with her fox pajamas and her chapter book. She looked up and studied his face for a moment with those precise dark eyes. She didn't say anything. She just nodded very slightly and went back to reading, as if she had already known what he'd decided before he told her. As if she had been waiting, patiently and without complaint, for him to catch up to what she had understood on the sidewalk on the morning of November 14th. Standing in the cold with her red coat and her slightly undone braid, looking at a woman in a green army jacket with the uncomplicated certainty of someone who simply knows what they know. Douglas Cole sent the location at 4:58 that afternoon. Jackson Street Shelter, intake name Zoe Marie Callahan, assigned to the women's dormitory, intake date 49 days prior. William read the address twice. Then he put the phone down on his desk very carefully and sat for a long moment in the silence of his office. His hands were still. Outside, the last light of a November afternoon faded from the city's windows. One by one, the way hope quietly dims when you convince yourself it was never really there to begin with. Douglas Cole was a compact, unhurried man who had spent 20 years as an investigator for the Chicago Police Department before deciding that the private sector offered better hours and considerably less paperwork. He had a gift for delivering difficult information without drama, which was why William had kept his number. When he called on the morning of November 21st, his voice had the same neutral, professional quality it always did. The voice of a man who understood that his job was to provide facts, and that the weight assigned to those facts belonged entirely to the person receiving them. "She's there," he said. "Jackson Street Shelter, Women's Wing, Cot 14. She's been there 49 days. Intake was under Callahan. She's been cooperative with shelter staff. No incidents. She volunteers in the kitchen 2 mornings a week." A brief pause. "She's in rough shape, Mr. Hart, but she's stable. I want you to understand what stable means in that context before you go." William was standing at the window of his office on the 32nd floor, looking at the city below. From up here, Michigan Avenue was a thin gray line of movement, and the Hendricks building was just one unremarkable facade among hundreds. "What does it mean?" he asked. "It means she's not in crisis. It means she gets up in the morning. It means she's trying." Another pause. Another. Shorter. "It also means she's been sleeping on a cot for 7 weeks, and before that she was on the street for longer than she'd probably tell you. Whatever happened to her, it happened slowly. The kind of slow that's hard to see until you're already at the bottom." William said nothing for a moment. Outside, a cloud passed over the sun and the city went a shade darker. "Does she know anyone's looking for her?" "No." "Good. Keep it that way." He turned from the window. "I'll handle it from here." He did not go that day. He told himself it was because he needed time to think, to prepare, to decide what he was going to say, to construct some framework for a conversation that had no precedent in anything he'd ever done. But the truth, which he acknowledged at approximately 11:30 that night, while staring at the ceiling of his bedroom, was simpler and less flattering. He was afraid. Not of Zoe exactly, not of what she'd become. He was afraid of what her face would do to him when he stood in front of her and had to hold simultaneously the man he'd spent 6 years building and the man he'd been before, the one who had kissed a scar above her eyebrow and meant it. Natalie noticed his hesitation the way she noticed everything, without comment, without pressure, and with a patience that was somehow worse than either. On Wednesday morning, when he dropped her at school, she held his hand at the crosswalk for a beat longer than usual. She didn't look up at him. She just held on, and then let go, and walked through the school doors without turning around. He went to the shelter that afternoon. The Jackson Street Shelter occupied the ground floor of a building that had been, at various points in its history, a warehouse, a community center, and a polling station. The lobby smelled of industrial cleaner and old coffee, and the woman at the front desk looked at William with the particular expression that shelter staff develop for visitors who arrive in Kashmir, not hostile, but carefully watchful, the way you watch a match near dry paper. "I'm here to see a resident," William said. "Zoe Callahan. Are you family?" He paused for only a fraction of a second. "Yes," he said. "I am." They brought her to a small room off the main hallway, the kind of room used for caseworker meetings, with 2 plastic chairs and a table and a window that looked onto a concrete wall. William stood when she came in. He had prepared for this. He had rehearsed, in the car on the way over, several versions of what the first sentence might be. None of them survived the moment she walked through the door. She looked older than 25 and younger than he'd expected, which made no sense until he understood that what he was seeing was not a number, but a condition. The particular appearance of a person who has been worn down by something specific and is, quietly and without assistance, trying to wear their way back. She was cleaner than she'd been on the sidewalk. Someone at the shelter had given her a navy blue sweater that was slightly too large. Her hair was pulled back. The scar above her left eyebrow caught the fluorescent light. She stopped when she saw him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The fluorescent light hummed. Somewhere down the hall, a door closed. "William?" she said. Her voice was the same. That was the thing he hadn't prepared for. Not the changes, but the sameness. The voice was entirely, unmistakably hers. "Zoe," he said. She sat down in one of the plastic chairs slowly, like someone who needed a moment to find the floor. He sat across from her. "How did you?" she began. "Natalie recognized you." He watched her face as he said it. He watched the words arrive. "On the street, last Tuesday, she told Patricia. Patricia told me." Zoe closed her eyes. When she opened them, they were very bright. "She was 4 months old," she said. "I know." She couldn't possibly have. I know, he said again. And yet, a silence opened between them. It was not a comfortable silence, but it was not a hostile one either. It was the silence of two people sitting in the presence of something too large to speak around and too important to approach carelessly. I'm not here to ask for explanations, William said finally. He had decided this in the car. He was going to hold to it. Not today. I'm here because my daughter, our daughter, has been asking about you since the moment she saw you, and I needed to see you with my own eyes before I could figure out what to do next. Zoe looked at him for a long moment. And what do you see? She asked. The question was not defensive. It was genuine. The question of someone who had stopped being able to see themselves clearly and was asking carefully for an outside report. William looked at her, at the scar, at the navy sweater, at the hands that had been shaking on the sidewalk and were now folded in her lap. Very still. I see someone who's still here, he said. When you could have kept walking, you stayed on that block. When I walked past you, you didn't call out, didn't make a scene, you just stayed. And I need to understand what that means before anything else. Zoe was quiet for a long moment, Then she said very quietly, It means I didn't know what I had the right to do. William nodded once, slowly. He stood up. I'll come back tomorrow, he said. We don't have to solve anything today. He moved to the door, then paused. She's doing well. Natalie. She reads constantly. She has my stubbornness and... He stopped. She has your patience. He left before she could respond. In the hallway, walking back toward the lobby, his jaw was tight, and his hands were in his pockets, and his stride was not quite as steady as it usually was. But he didn't stop. He kept walking, the way he always had. The difference was that this time, he was already planning to come back. What happens next will stay with you, I promise. Before we get there, tell me in the comments, do you believe some people deserve a second chance even after causing real pain? And like this story if you do. Or even if you're not sure, he came back the next day. And the day after that. By the end of the first week there was a ritual to it. William arriving at 4 o'clock after the school pickup, sitting in the plastic chair across from Zoe while the fluorescent light hummed overhead, talking about things that were adjacent to the thing they were both circling. He told her about the Singapore deal. She told him about Ruth, the former school teacher in the cot across from hers. He told her about Natalie's chapter books, about the fox pajamas, about the way she nodded when she'd already figured out what he was going to decide before he decided it. Zoe listened to all of this with an expression that William could not fully read. Something between grief and gratitude, with a quality of attention so complete that it felt sometimes like being forgiven for something you hadn't yet confessed. Natalie, meanwhile, had not been told. William had decided this carefully, not out of cruelty, but out of the same instinct that made him read a contract 3 times before signing. He needed to understand what he was agreeing to before he involved his daughter, because involving Natalie meant something irreversible. Once she knew that the woman on the street was real and present and sitting in a room 4 miles from her school, there would be no taking it back. And William was not yet sure. After 6 years of building walls and burying things and learning to function without the part of himself that Zoe had occupied, whether he was capable of not taking it back. But Natalie knew anyway. He wasn't sure how. He hadn't told Patricia, and Patricia was, as far as he could tell, genuinely uninformed. But on the 5th evening, when he came home from the shelter and sat down at the kitchen table with a glass of water and the particular expression of a man who has spent an hour doing something emotionally expensive, Natalie looked up from her book and said, "You found her." It was not a question. "Yes," William said. "Is she okay?" "She's getting better." Natalie nodded and returned to her book. After a moment she said, without looking up, "When can I see her?" "I don't know yet, sweetheart." "Okay." She turned a page. "I'll wait." And she did. She waited with the same quality of patient composure that she brought to everything. And William understood, watching her, that this was not indifference. This was the opposite of indifference. This was a child who had decided, at some foundational level, that the people she loved were worth waiting for, no matter how long it took, no matter what they'd done. He didn't know where she had learned this. He suspected she had arrived with it. The conversations with Zoe grew harder before they grew easier, because the easy territory ran out and the real territory began. She told him about the postpartum depression, not as an excuse, she was careful to say, but as a geography. Here is what the ground looked like. Here is why I couldn't find footing. Here is how a person who loved her child and her husband and her life can still, in the dark and the silence and the exhaustion of 2 a.m., make a decision that destroys everything she loves. She told it without flinching, and William listened without interrupting. And when she finished, the room was very quiet. I thought about you every day, she said, both of you. I thought about calling. I picked up phones and put them down more times than I can count. I told myself it was too late, that you'd moved on, that showing up would only make things worse. It would have, William said. For the first 2 years, it would have. Zoe looked at him. And now? He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the November light was doing what November light does in Chicago, giving up early, retreating from the city in long gray stages, leaving the streets to the cold and the artificial glow of storefronts. I'm angry, he said. I want to be clear about that. I'm not going to pretend 6 years didn't happen, or that Natalie didn't grow up without a mother, or that I didn't spend the first year after you left convinced that there was something I'd done, something I'd missed, some version of events where it was my fault. He paused. It took me a long time to stop trying to make it my fault because the alternative, that you made a choice and left, was harder to live with. Zoe absorbed this. I know. So I'm angry, he continued. But I also... He stopped, looked at his hands, looked at her. I also drove to a shelter every day this week. So clearly I'm not only angry. Something moved across Zoe's face. Not a smile, not quite, but the preliminary shape of one. The shape of a face, remembering that it knows how to smile. What are you then? She asked softly. He thought about Natalie, at the kitchen table, turning pages without looking up. I'll wait. I'm someone trying to figure out if the person I'm looking at is who I remember, he said. And if that person still... He stopped again. He was not a man who left sentences unfinished. He left this one unfinished. Zoe finished it for him, quietly. Still what? He didn't answer. He stood up and put on his coat. At the door, he paused. There's a program, he said. A transitional housing situation connected to the shelter. Single rooms, private, with wraparound support, therapy, employment services, the works. I spoke to the director this morning. There's a spot available starting Monday. He didn't look at her. It's not an obligation. I'm not. This is not me trying to manage you or fix you or make you into something convenient. I just thought you should know it exists. Zoe was very still. Why? She asked. Why are you doing any of this? He was quiet for a long moment. Then, because my daughter told me to find her mother before it got colder. And I have never, in 6 years, been able to tell that child no when she was right. He left. In the hallway, walking to the exit, his breath was uneven in a way it almost never was. He pressed the elevator button and waited, and when the doors opened and he stepped inside and the doors closed behind him, he stood very still in the mirrored box of it and looked at his own reflection and thought, I am not ready for this. And then, I don't think ready was ever going to be an option. On the ride home, his phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number that he understood immediately was Zoe, using a shelter phone. Monday works, thank you. He stared at the message for a long time. Then he typed back one word. Good. It was not forgiveness. It was not a promise. It was the first sentence of something that didn't have a name yet. But it existed, in the space between two phones in a city at night, and it was real. That evening, without explaining why, he sat down on the edge of Natalie's bed while Patricia said goodnight. Natalie was already under the covers with her book. She looked at him over the top of it. Dad, she said. Yeah? You should tell her I remember her hands. William looked at his daughter for a long moment. The bedside lamp made her face warm and serious and entirely itself. I will, he said. I promise. He turned off her light and stood in the dark hallway outside her room for a moment. one hand on the doorframe. The apartment was quiet. The city hummed 17 floors below. He had no idea what came next. He only knew that it was coming, and that it was going to require more of him than anything he had ever done. More than the company, more than the deals, more than the 6 years of building himself back from a wreckage he'd never fully admitted to anyone, including himself. More than all of that. And somewhere in the geography of that knowledge, beneath the fear and the anger and the years of careful functional grief, there was something else. Something he hadn't expected to find. Something that felt, cautiously and without permission, like the beginning of hope. This is the chapter I've been building toward since the very beginning. The one that will make everything make sense. Stay with me until the very last word. And if this story touched you, please leave a comment and share it with someone who needs it today. The transitional housing program operated out of a converted 3-flat in Pilsen. 6 blocks from a train stop and 2 blocks from a bakery that opened at 5:30 in the morning and filled the street with the smell of bread. Zoe moved in on a Monday. Her room was small, a single bed, a dresser, a window that looked onto a courtyard where someone had planted a bare-limbed tree that would, she was told, be covered in white flowers come April. She stood at the window for a long time the first night looking at the tree, thinking about April. It was the first time in longer than she could remember that she had thought about a month that hadn't arrived yet. The program had requirements. Twice-weekly therapy sessions with a counselor named Dr. Anita Reeves, who was 52, direct, and had the specific gift of asking the question you'd been trying not to hear in a way that made it impossible to keep not hearing it. Weekly check-ins with a case manager. A job readiness workshop on Thursdays. Zoe attended all of it with the diligence of someone who understood that she was not in a position to cut corners, and with the growing, cautious understanding that the structure itself, the appointments, the schedules, the small reliable obligations of a life organized around things that happened at specific times, was, in its own quiet way, healing. William called on Wednesday evening. "How is it?" he asked. "It has a window," she said. A pause. "That's a yes?" "That's a yes." They talked for 20 minutes. About the tree. About the bakery. About a book Dr. Reeves had recommended that Zoe had already read twice. It was, on the surface, an ordinary conversation. Underneath it was something careful and enormous, and not yet named, the way the foundation of a building exists before the walls go up. Invisible, essential, bearing all the weight. "I told Natalie about the hands," he said near the end. Zoe went very still. "What did she say?" "She nodded," William said. "The way she does when she already knew." Zoe laughed, and it surprised her. A small, sudden thing, like a light coming on in a room that had been dark for a long time. "She was always going to be yours," she said softly. "Even before she was born, I could feel her. That particular quality of certainty. You think things through while everyone else is still reacting. She does the same thing. She has your patience," William said. He had said it in the shelter, briefly, and let it go. Now he said it again, and it landed differently. Another pause, then, "Can I ask you something?" "Yes," Zoe said. "Did you ever stop?" He stopped. He was doing it again. The unfinished sentences. He started over. "In all the years, in the diner, in the boarding house, in all of it, did you ever stop thinking about what it would have been like if you'd come back?" Zoe stood at the window. The courtyard was dark. The bare-limbed tree was a thin silhouette against the sodium glow of the street beyond the wall. "Never once," she said. "Not for a single day." The silence between them was different from the silences in the shelter room. This one had warmth in it. The particular warmth of two people who have decided without announcing it that the conversation is not over. 3 weeks later, on a Saturday morning in December, William brought Natalie to Pilsen. He had told her the night before, quietly, sitting on the edge of her bed. He had said, "The woman from the street is your mother." He had said, "She has been very sick and she is getting better." He had said, "We are going to go see her tomorrow, and you do not have to feel any particular way about it, because whatever you feel will be right." Natalie had listened with her characteristic stillness. When he finished, she asked, "Does she know I'm coming?" "Yes." Does she want to see me? Very much. Natalie had nodded then, the single small nod that meant the matter was settled and she was ready to proceed. She had gone to sleep. In the morning she was dressed and waiting by the door at 8:15 in her red coat with the brass buttons. Her two braids fastened precisely and without any of the usual left side unraveling, which told William more than any words could have about the significance she was assigning to the day. Zoe was waiting in the courtyard of the transitional house when they arrived. She was wearing a gray coat that the program had helped her find at a resale shop. And her hair was down, and her hands were in her pockets, and when the gate opened and she saw them, William first and then Natalie, she went very still in the way of someone bracing for something that might be wonderful or might be devastating, and has decided to hold both possibilities at once. Natalie walked through the gate. She stopped about 6 feet from Zoe and looked at her. She didn't run. She didn't speak. She just stood there and looked, with those precise dark eyes, and the look was not hostile or joyful or accusing or forgiving. It was simply complete, the look of a person taking in a fact that has been missing for a long time, and finding that it fits exactly the space it was supposed to fill. Then she took 3 steps forward and she held out her hand. It was not a hug. It was something more careful than a hug, and more deliberate and more significant. It was a 6-year-old girl extending her hand to a woman she had decided, without flinching, to begin to know. Zoe looked at the small outstretched hand. Her eyes were very bright. She crouched down so that she and Natalie were at the same level, and she took the hand in both of hers. "Hi," Natalie said. "Hi," Zoe said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Your hands are soft," Natalie said. "Like in my dream." Zoe made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob, but was entirely human. The sound of something cracking open that had been held shut for too long. She pressed her lips together and nodded, and held Natalie's hand, and for a long moment the courtyard was entirely quiet. William stood at the gate, watching. His throat was tight and his hands were in his pockets, and he was not looking away. It did not happen all at once after that. It was not a movie, where the music swells and the montage begins and the family assembles itself in a single golden afternoon. It was slower than that, and more complicated, and more honest, and infinitely more real. Natalie warmed to Zoe the way winter warms to spring, imperceptibly at first, then undeniably. She asked questions. She listened to answers. She brought her chapter books. She read aloud once, sitting on Zoe's bed in the small room with the window and the courtyard tree, and Zoe sat very still and listened, and did not cry until Natalie had fallen asleep on the drive home. Zoe did the work. That was the part that William watched most carefully. Because he had been hurt before and he knew the difference between a person who says they are changing and a person who is actually changing. The difference lives not in declarations, but in 1,000 small consecutive choices made when no one is applauding. She attended every session with Dr. Reeves. She completed the job readiness program and took a position as a junior designer at a small firm in the West Loop, not unlike the one she'd had before, and went to work every morning with the kind of seriousness that comes from understanding exactly what is at stake. She built her days carefully, one honest brick at a time. And William, who had spent 6 years becoming very good at not feeling things, at filing them away in the place where they couldn't reach him, learned slowly, and not without difficulty, that the place had a door, and the door could open, and that opening it did not. In fact, destroy the structure he had built around it. He was angry, and then he was less angry, and then one evening in February, sitting across from Zoe at a kitchen table with coffee between them and Natalie, asleep down the hall in her own bed, he said, "I forgive you." He said it plainly, without drama, the way he would state a fact he had verified. Because that was what it was. A fact he had verified, slowly, over weeks and months of evidence collected not from promises but from presence. Zoe looked at him across the table. Her hands were wrapped around her mug. Her eyes were steady. "I don't deserve it yet," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm giving it anyway, because I'm tired of being the person who doesn't." They sat in the quiet kitchen for a long time after that, with the coffee and the winter dark outside the window, and the sound of a city that kept moving no matter what happened inside the lives it held. There was no grand moment, no orchestral climax. Just two people sitting with what they had broken and what they had kept, and what, in the long and patient work of it, they were beginning, carefully, to rebuild. In April, the tree in the Pilsen courtyard bloomed. Natalie stood at Zoe's window and looked at the white flowers and said, with the matter-of-fact conviction of someone reporting a thing that has always been true, "I knew it would look like that." Zoe stood beside her. Their shoulders were almost touching. "How did you know?" Zoe asked. Natalie thought about it for a moment, with the gravity she brought to every question worth considering. "Because someone told me to wait," she said, "and waiting is just believing something is still coming." Outside, the flowers were white against the April sky, and the city moved in its constant way, and somewhere on Michigan Avenue the Hendricks building was still under renovation, and would be for some time to come. But in a small room in Pilsen, at a window in the morning light, a woman and a little girl stood together in the particular silence of people who have found their way to something true. Not easily, not without cost, not without the long, patient work of becoming the people they needed to be. And it was enough. It was more than enough, it was everything.